Hi, I'm your host Dave Kemp, and this is Future Ear Radio. Each episode, we're breaking down one new thing, one cool new finding that's happening in the world of hearables, the world of voice technology. How are these worlds starting to intersect? How are these worlds starting to collide? What cool things are going to come from this intersection of technology? Without further ado, let's get on with the show. All right, so we have a little bit of a different episode this time around. This is the first in-person podcast that I've ever done. I got my Rodecaster equipment here so that I can start to do these kinds of in-person interviews. And the first person that I wanted to do, now that I have the equipment to do an in-person interview, is none other than A.U. Bankaitis, Dr. A.U. Bankaitis. So welcome on. I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for a while, and now that we have the equipment, we can do it. So let's just start. Introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us about who you are and what you do.
So, A.U. Bankaitis, that's my first name, is not my real name. It's actually Auksė. It's Lithuanian. Got the nickname when I was in college. But the interesting thing about me, Dr. A.U. Bankaitis, is you're looking at somebody who, A, had zero plans of ever going to college, let alone pursue a PhD. Number two, when I was a junior in college, I had decided, it'd be great to be an audiologist, until I found out you had to have a master's degree. So I almost changed my major. And then at one point in my career, when I was a little bit lost and wasn't sure what I wanted to do, I amicably left a job and figured I'm probably not going to be an audiologist. So I've tried to leave a field. No offense, I love audiology, but I think that's one of the most interesting things that I laugh about, thinking, wow, I love audiology, but try to leave it a couple times.
So how did you even get into audiology? I mean, what road led you to that?
So the funny thing is, once I decided to go, my dad convinced me to go to college. I basically, literally, my plan after high school was to move to New York, get a job, meaning waiting tables. I loved football, and I wanted to be an announcer for football, and I figured I'll just figure out a way to do it. So my dad was like, hey, long story short, don't you think you'd have a better chance at that if you went to college and actually got a communications degree? So that's the only reason I ended up at Cleveland State University, because I grew up on the west side of Cleveland, Fairview Park, and about a month before the fall quarter started, that's when I applied, got accepted, and figured I'll try one quarter. So with the communications major, you had to take certain requirements. So I had to take like a communication disorders intro class, which I thought was interesting. I'm like, this is cool. So then I thought I was going to be a speech language pathologist, a very probably similar story to most of my colleagues. And then when I had to take intro to audiology, it's the infamous Frederick Martin textbook, where I open up to the page where they have the dime, and on top of the dime, they have the three ossicles. And I just said, this is freaking cool, and just loved it. Audiology to me was more black and white, very scientific-y, and I simply decided that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You do have a little bit of a scientific brain, I would say.
A little bit, yeah.
And so, I say we as in the Kemps, so my dad and mom and Michael, my brother, we were at the Lybarger award ceremony, and we'll talk about this more, but I loved the award speech that you gave, and it helped to kind of inform how I wanted to do this conversation, because you outlined that you said there were three BKs, quote, BKs, that helped shape in your kind of career trajectory. And the first one, and I feel like this is a good place to start with kind of like the throughput here, is this professor that you had that really nudged you toward getting your PhD. So can you kind of just walk me through, okay, you had this epiphany, audiology, pretty interesting. At what point did you decide, not only do I want to go and pursue audiology, I want to get a PhD in audiology?
So in my junior year, I did try to change majors, and I actually went to the counseling department where you take all these different tests, and it just cracked me up because, it spit out everything, like you should be a speech language pathologist or audiologist. I'm like, okay, I guess the universe is telling me this is the path you need to take. So reluctantly, I'm like, I can't believe I have to go get a master's degree because that was the requirement. So when I started the graduate program at Cleveland State University, I didn't even go to my undergraduate ceremony because it was on Sunday, and the next day I was starting graduate school because I just wanted to graduate as quickly as possible, and see patients and do all that fun stuff. Well, there was a newly hired assistant professor in Bartik at Bamna who was great. And by the second quarter, because I had to take a couple classes from her, obviously, she quickly pulled me aside one day and just said, you should seriously consider pursuing a PhD. And her saying that, I sort of laughed at first, like, who are you talking to? And that quick comment, I remember all during the weekend, I would hear her say it and just go, I can't believe she said that to me. I can't believe she said that to me. Why did she say that to me? I never thought I was perhaps smart enough, or in my head, that wasn't part of my plan. So I never thought about it. But within a relatively short period of time, her and I started doing research, and I realized that, yeah, this is probably something that I need to explore. And she was extremely influential in, inspiring me to continue my educational studies. And she actually came from the University of Cincinnati. So that was one of the schools that I applied to, and I ended up choosing the University of Cincinnati for a couple of reasons, namely because she was able to hook me up, or the program was able to assign a mentor to me at that time, Dr. Keith, who I never met and didn't really know much about. But so that's how University of Cincinnati basically came into play.
So when we were kind of talking through before we started recording, we were coming up with like some of the different themes that we might want to talk about, and something that you've been a pretty big proponent about lately, and you wanted to talk about on this is imposter phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And I find this to be so interesting because anyone that knows you don't, on the surface, seem like somebody that would have this. And that just is surely speaking of probably not being aware of how pervasive it is. But I just find this to be interesting that you had mentioned the first time that you really started to feel this was right around this time in your career. And you've had bouts of it, I guess you would say, throughout your career. And I just, again, think that someone that's as accomplished as you, those of us who are coming up now can look to you, and I think it resonates to say, wait, you've had this. And so I just want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk through that. So can you just share how this all, I guess, originated?
Well, I think, and I didn't know, you feel what you feel, and you sometimes don't know if it means anything other than that's what you're feeling. And because I was never going to go to college, I think pursuing a PhD, getting accepted, it did freak me out a little bit because I never felt like I was smart enough, and thought, my God, I have to work 10 times harder to make sure that I succeed. I had a couple of siblings who pursued PhDs, but I always looked at them as, man, they're super uber smart, and I just never put myself in that same category. So that was part of it. I was also a little bit concerned about, because the University of Cincinnati's program was outstanding. And one of the things that intimidated me was you not only had to, you're getting your PhD, but you also have to pick, 3 different minors. And one of the minors that they forced you to pick, which meant you had to take at least 7 courses in, was statistics. And I just thought, oh my God, I'm not a, calculus, wizard. And that so all of that just intimidated me. So that's where it started. Where it really kicked in was before the age of 30, because I got my PhD when I was 27. But right before the age of 30, okay, so I graduated with a PhD. While at the University of Cincinnati, I received the Distinguished Dissertation Award for my research, which is a pretty big deal. They choose one dissertation topic out of every department, medicine, engineering, whatever. Yeah, so,
Kind
of a big deal. I walked around with a crown for about a week. But anyway, so you get these research awards. I published nearly 20 works, a lot of it in the area of HIV/AIDS and infection control that were peer-reviewed or book chapters. I ended up developing a niche expertise in infection control, and I was, being asked to do a lot of either state level or national level talks. And the best way to basically describe imposter phenomenon is to let you know what was going in my head during that time. So despite all of these successes and accomplishments, there were two things that were basically going on. Number one, I was unconsciously or subconsciously attributing my accomplishments to something other than my own ability. So my dissertation topic was HIV and AIDS. So I automatically was like, well, of course I got the Distinguished Dissertation Award because this is it's a new disease. It's a new virus. Perhaps it would be politically incorrect for them not to choose my topic.
Right place, right time.
Correct. It was just timing, hot topic. Awesome. And then I started thinking, man, how lucky was I? And people are just being nice. And, that's what was going through my head. And then the second thing that I was doing, I was overworking and overexerting to the point where I assigned astronomically high standards for my own work. So there was a tendency for me to obsess about everything had to be perfect. I agonized over the smallest flaws, always focusing on what could have been done better instead of looking at the overall picture going, hey, this was pretty good. But most importantly, and this is very critical for people to understand imposter phenomenon, I was actually ignoring constructive criticism. And the reason I didn't want to hear it, and constructive criticism isn't bad.
Yeah.
But the reason I didn't want to hear it is because I perceived that any kind of feedback like that was an indicator of my ineptness. Mm-hmm. So you start to not listen to any of that. So at the end of the day, my head was filled with so much self-doubt that there would be times I would be on my way to a presentation or right before I had to present and go, holy crap, how the hell did I get here? Mm-hmm. I don't belong here. I think somebody made a mistake, and so much that I constantly depreciated my own value by never giving myself any credit. So basically, the whole definition of imposter phenomenon is chronic self-doubt due to the inability to own your own success. And man, it's real. I had constant chronic self-doubt, and I was incapable of owning my own success. And it's pretty scary when you get in that situation.
This sort of reminds me of what we're seeing from Naomi Osaka, that young female tennis star who has come out saying she's been battling this really crippling self-doubt and anxiety, top of her game, world superstar, and she's not above that, I guess. And then with you, it's sort of analogous, like in your trajectory, within your academic career, you have the best dissertation, like literally the best dissertation across all the PhDs in your class, but that you're still saying that there was a lot of this imposter phenomenon. So I just find this to be really interesting, and it seems to me like the only way that you can really solve this is from within, right?
There is something that researchers, and you're correct, but there is something that researchers call a cycle of distress. And this cycle of distress is more typical of women. And imposter phenomenon does happen in both men and women, although research clearly shows that it's like at least double you're going to see it twice more often in women than in men. And then the other interesting thing is it actually manifests differently in men versus women. So research shows that men basically tend to attribute success to ability, whereas women tend to attribute success to listening and working hard. So men and women, as a result of that, are going to have different triggers. So for men, the trigger of imposter phenomenon tends to be fear of being unsuccessful, which is why a common coping mechanism is for them to choose to be in a place where they can be a big fish in a small pond. Whereas for women, the trigger tends to be an achievement-related task. Like even applying for a job can trigger imposter phenomenon. There's this interesting research statistic that shows men will apply, if there's 10 bullet points of requirements for a job, men will apply as long as they meet 4. Women will not apply unless they meet all 10.
Wow.
So that's the big mind difference, the gender difference. So women, because of the way they approach it, they tend to fall into what's called this cycle of distress, which is important to appreciate if you want to manage your imposter phenomenon. Before I talk about that, just real quickly, like according to, I think it was the International Journal of Behavioral Sciences, they said that nearly 70% of adults go through, this crisis of confidence that could be consistent with imposter phenomenon. So there's nothing wrong with having these feelings. Yeah. It's just understanding that it's common and it's real, and there are ways to manage it. And in order for me to manage mine, it's important, let me just break in a nutshell this cycle of distress. So for women, and that includes me, I'm a woman. An achievement-related task would be assigned, and that would basically trigger the self-doubt in your head, like, okay, and then that creates a lot of anxiety. And then that anxiety ends up causing you to over-prepare, overwork. Interestingly, in some cases, it can also manifest as an initial phase of prolonged procrastination, where you then eventually, end up experiencing this extremely intense last-minute rate of over-preparation. But at the end of the day, you're over-preparing, overworking. And then once the task is completed and delivered, there's a tendency to discount feedback. And as the feedback is discounted, the voices in your head tell you that you succeeded because of you put in so many hours, you burned the midnight oil. It was lucky that you got it done the last minute. And basically, this record in your head ultimately diminishes the validity of your achievement. And with each new achievement-related task, this cycle of distress begins over and over again until you get to the point where you just simply cannot own your success. So for me, I call it my ABCs. And what's important is this is what worked for me. I actually got out of this rut about 10 years ago, but then it resurfaced again. And I had to do a couple things to get over it. But I think what would be interesting is to break down what I would go through internally, like when I was asked to do an infection control presentation.
Perfect.
So I can do an infection control presentation in my sleep.
Yeah.
I've been talking about infection control since 1995, okay?
Literally wrote the book on it in infection control in the hearing clinic.
Yeah, and I feel extremely confident. Like if somebody stopped me in the hall, I'd be like, blah, 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 and it's like no big deal.
Yeah.
As soon as somebody would call and say, hey, would you be willing to do a presentation? As soon as I said yes, okay, it created a lot of anxiety because suddenly I would be like, oh, shoot. Like, I wonder how many people are going to be attending, who's going to be there. Another thing that happened early on in my career that actually contributed to this is I would not only over-prepare, and then go, okay, once you get on the plane, you're okay. I remember going to a conference and, registering because I'm like, oh, okay, I wonder who else is presenting. And when I saw like a list of 3 people who I'm like, oh my God, these are real researchers. These are real audiologists. These are people that almost had a quasi panic attack where I'm like, I can't believe I'm on the same program. And that led me to go to my hotel room to basically write out a script. Okay, a 1 hour presentation, if you write out word for word what you're going to say, you're talking about, 30 pages. And that's what I started doing because I'm just like, in order for me to be on the same stage as these individuals, I need to sound smart. I need to look smart. I need to do all these things. And I would obsess and obsess and obsess. I would never go out to dinner with colleagues before a presentation because I would have to practice my presentation because it had to be perfect. And it was almost like I would memorize a 1 hour presentation. And if I got one word wrong while I was talking, practicing in the hotel room, I would start all over again. I mean, it was just obsessive awfulness. And then once I presented, I was done. Yeah, it wasn't so bad. I was so relieved. But the reason I was relieved is because I was tired because I didn't sleep the night before. I worked too hard. And I just was like, oh my God, I finally am not putting myself in a position where people are going to say, well, she doesn't belong here. Like, what are you doing here? And I just remember the only fun time after a presentation was getting on a plane and being able to sleep. On the way home.
Knocking back a couple cocktails on the way home.
Oh, yeah. So it was during a AAA when I had to do like an ALD talk, and I was actually working for Oaktree. It was very early on, and I remember the Oaktree gang was like, come out to dinner with us. I'm like, I can't. And that's when I finally realized I cannot go to dinner with my colleagues and coworkers because I'm obsessing over perfection. And that's when I'm like, this shit's got to stop or it's gonna kill me. So I was able to manage it, but when it resurfaced recently, I had to take additional steps, and this is where the ABCs come in. So the first thing I had to do is acknowledge it, and I think anybody who's experiencing imposter phenomenon feelings, and there's a really good 20 item survey that was created by Dr. Patricia Rose Chance. You can look her up. She's the queen of imposter phenomenon. She was the psychologist who first started talking about it in 1978. You can take this scale, and it's not a diagnostic scale, but it's basically designed to allow you to compare how you compare to others when it comes to feelings of imposterism. So when I took that scale, I was like, oh, wow. I have some things that I need to obviously work on. So one of it was acknowledging it. And actually part of my acknowledgement was talking about it. So in 2021, I was actually trying to back out of a presentation. It was during the Dr. Jill Wow thing. I was supposed to talk about negotiations, which I can totally talk about negotiations, but I was so down a deep, dark rabbit hole of self-doubt that I finally had to tell Jill, I don't think I can do a presentation. And she was like, okay. And she asked me, is there any other topic you want to talk about? And finally, after a week, I said, you know what? I really need to talk about imposter phenomenon because I had started reading up more about it and started realizing how it paralyzed me. So, acknowledging it, talking about it, but, you can't talk yourself out of imposter phenomenon. So the other thing I had to do is break the cycle of distress. There's a really good book that I would recommend for women. It's by Valerie Young. And she's the author of The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. And one of the first things, she suggests in breaking the cycle is, start out small. And it says, and basically she says, when somebody pays you a compliment, say thank you, and then shut up. And let me tell you, you do that little experiment. I couldn't believe how many times people would say something to me and I would go, oh, thanks, but.
Right.
Oh, thanks, but. Oh, well, I had a lot of help.
Just self-deprecation all the time.
Yeah, and you start, when you start consciously going, wow, I can't believe I'm doing that automatically, it just makes you aware. And it's not the magic, the pill that's going to fix everything. But the other thing that I started doing, and again, these are things that worked for me, you have to understand a little bit about, I guess, brain plasticity, which is the ability of the brain to develop new brain cells, form new connections, and functionally adapt as a result of experience. So I always appreciated brain plasticity, and I came across the work of a psychologist and neuroscientist who got all his degrees from Harvard, so I assumed he was a pretty smart guy. But his name is Richard Davidson. He's actually the founder of the Center of Healthy Minds in Wisconsin. And what his research found was that people become more resilient. You know, there's people around here that, man, water off a duck's back. There's other people, they spill their milk and it like ruins their entire week. Yeah. And a lot of, he was doing a lot of this kind of neuroscience research, and he found that people became more resilient when they have increased interactions between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And the amygdala is basically your brain's emotion center that processes threatening and fearful stimuli as well as anxiety. And what he found is the way that you strengthen this, and research shows it, is through what's called mindful breathing. And I say all this because in the past, people would tell me, do some mindful breathing. And I'd be like, okay, I would do it for like 30 seconds and said, screw you. I don't have time for this, right?
Because it's that is very much on point for you.
Yeah. Then you're just like, what the heck am I doing? But when I started reading his research and he connected the dots going, okay, this is what's actually happening, you sort of give it a bigger chance. And so that's what I used to do. When I used to feel overwhelmed at work, I would stop and just do some mindful breathing. And it really created a nice anchor to be in the present, in the now, and just to chill out and not worry about that stuff. The other thing that I had to do was control the self-doubt. And this is we all have what I call challenging ants in our head, which are these automatic negative thoughts. And I had a lot of them. And I literally one day, when I was preparing for an infection control presentation and I was freaking out, going, people are going to think I'm dumb. People aren't going to believe me. And this was during the COVID pandemic.
Right.
Because you would think, oh my God, AU's going to be so prepared to respond. And I was, but I think what people didn't see was what was happening behind the curtain, every day, just going, what if I say the wrong thing? Is it going to mean that their business is going to shut down? I mean, those are like the weird things that go through your head. So I literally had to sit down and I had to write a list of everything associated with infection control that made me knowledgeable. And you start writing it and you find, I felt silly, but after a while you have this physical piece of paper that's evidence of why are you self-doubting yourself so much? And then I had to do what I call, there's always that elevator pitch, like, if you're involved in business, make sure you have a 20-second, pitch that you can tell somebody what you do, what your business is, blah, 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 practice it. So I decided to make an elevated you pitch because I'm like, okay, I need to create something that I can repeat to myself if I start feeling like out of control, where imposter phenomenon is just the chronic self-doubt is going to paralyze me. And literally, I had to do this before every presentation at one point. But basically, the message I had to tell myself is I had to take a deep breath and just go, hey, you know this shit. And that's what I had to say out loud. And then once I said that, I was like, okay. And I was able to move on in a productive manner. So those are the things that worked for me. There's so many things available out there. So, even going to a psychologist or psychiatrist, whatever. But these are the things that actually worked for me and have helped me tremendously.
Yeah, I feel like we've all probably had a semblance of this. It varies in the degree of severity from person to person. Instances where people might find themselves in a situation where they don't really feel qualified to be on the same stage as someone and feel underwhelmed by their own accomplishments when you're comparing them to other people. And for me, one of my big takeaways from this conversation is the importance of finding a balance of being aspirational, but not getting too caught up in like quote unquote keeping up with the Jetsons. Like we all bring a unique and value perspective to the table, and it's simply different from those around one, you or one another.
Agreed. And so in an appropriate context, if your feelings associated with imposter phenomena can certainly be a motivator. However, when you start getting into this cycle of distress, it's a huge problem because it comes at a very high cost in the form of living in constant anxiety, which is physically, mentally, emotionally exhausting. Over preparing, overachieving, which usually results to burnout, and also, stifling potential where opportunities arise. So, one of the things, and to your point, that I also had to do was I had to stop the cycle of over preparing. And, how do you stop the cycle of over preparing, when that's all you've done for like, for like 20 years. And part of it was realizing I needed to stop being a perfectionist. And perfectionists hold themselves to unrealistically high standards. That does a couple things. It actually makes life less satisfying. Even trivial things become stressful. So, because you're focusing on what went wrong versus the overall picture. And like I said, you get emotionally burnt out and tired. And I think what's important for people to understand, perfectionism is not the same thing as having a healthy drive to excel. Mm-hmm. You can seek excellence without demanding perfection. And Julie Cameron basically has a really nice quote, and she basically says, perfectionism is not a quest for the best. It is a pursuit of the worst in ourselves, the part that tells us that nothing we will do will ever be good enough. So for me, I had to adjust unrealistic standards. So I had to let go of my super high astronomical standards and basically tell myself not everything deserves 100% effort. Yeah. The other thing is I had to set smart, realistic goals that were specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So I got to the point where instead of spending 24 hours on a 1 hour infection control presentation that I've already done 100 times, right? I would tell myself, you have 2 hours, and that's it. And then you're done. And you can't write a script, and you're done. And I sort of had to force myself to do those things. And then I had to really just cut myself some slack by giving myself permission to prepare without perfection. And, in that book that I mentioned by Valerie Young, she has a list of rights in the back of her book that I really liked, where it says you have the right to make mistakes. You have the right to be wrong. You have the right to have an off day. You have the right to say no without feeling guilty. And you have the right to achieve above or below the expectation of others. And just realizing and then making a plan has just made it so much easier to live life.
Well, I think it's interesting, and I wonder if this is a byproduct of just it being more top of mind now that people are acknowledging it. But like I hear it all the time, and I wonder if it's also something that young people, because of the fact that you're not as accomplished, you feel like, okay, how can I be someone that can hold a candle to this person that I'm presenting in front of or behind that has 20 years my senior. But I think it's interesting to hear you say, you had mentioned that it resurfaced later in life as well. So it's not something that's a young person thing.
No, it's not. And it actually surprised me when it resurfaced, and it took me a while to realize that that's what was happening. So, during the pandemic, you remember when we had to sit there and go, what are we doing? And we decided we're going to send everybody home with pay and just, which everybody was making those decisions. So everybody was stressed out. Everybody was unsure. People were like, it was just a really, really scary time. So I contributed that to, okay, everybody's just stressed out. And, I was upset going, oh my God, I hope the tree is going to be fine. And, and I hope our customers are going to be fine. Like, it was just terrible. But what I started realizing was one day, at first I thought, God, are you just depressed? Because this is sad, because we used to have, there was a group of women colleagues. We used to have happy hours every week. And, part of it was, somebody was losing a business and you're just like, oh my God, what can we do? Or whatever. And it was just stressful. But what happened to me, I assumed it was the pandemic, but what happened to me is I started, every day I was getting multiple phone calls. I was working remotely from work, more than happy to talk to people. But then when people started asking, hey, we need a presentation, it wasn't for CEU purposes. It was, we need to be up to date. And I started getting a little bit overwhelmed simply from the perspective that, God, I've been talking about infection control and all my life. And now we have this new thing and it's fluid and it's ever changing. And so I was having a little bit difficulty reading all the CDC stuff and keeping up, but I was doing a fine job. I mean, that's how we figured out the list and disinfect. Like, I was on top of it. But slowly those negative feelings started creeping in where I'm like, God, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I tell somebody? And it's so silly that I look back at it now. What? I'm going to tell them to use this disinfectant, and if they don't, their business is going to shut down. Right. But in your head, I was just so concerned that I was going to say the wrong thing that was going to cost somebody their business, that I went down a really deep, dark rabbit hole where it got to the point where I and Oaktree products didn't know this, but I would say no to presentations. They were remote, but I'm like, no, I couldn't do it because I just simply got paralyzed and I couldn't snap out of it. So I went through that process, and then I started reading up, and then I started getting the help I needed to talk about it, and there it was. But it's pretty ironic that something that I've studied for all my life, that I should be most prepared to deliver. I did deliver, but I went down that rabbit hole.
Right.
So it was a dark place for a little bit.
Yeah, it's it's kind of crazy too. Like, just kind of touching on that part of your story is, so you get your PhD at the height of the AIDS epidemic or right after the AIDS epidemic, so this real topical thing, and then as time goes on, I kind of was joking about how you and Bob taught me the infection control talk. I was in the Wisconsin Dells for like the Wisconsin Hearing Alliance. I think it was like January or February of 2020. And there was a slide in my presentation that was talking about the importance of infection control, just sort of in passing, mentioning the potential for pandemics. And I remember I had people emailing me afterwards as the pandemic broke out, people being like, did you know something? But my point is it's like, so this thing that you were an expert in, and you sort of built your expertise on, becomes extremely relevant again, 20 years later. Yeah. And then I think it's just fascinating though. And I think, like, for me, this is so interesting to just hear about, is like, you were maybe the most qualified person to speak on this specific topic at this specific time, and yet it's still, the imposter phenomenon rears its ugly head.
Yeah.
I just find that interesting.
But I think, if you talk to more people within our field, I remember polling, and it was not a scientific poll and whatever, but I did ask like 3 or 4 questions from the imposter scale phenomenon. I put it on a closed Facebook group and just said, hey, answer these questions. And basically what happens is you're answering questions and you assign a number 1 to 5 as to how true that statement is of you. So for example, I often worry about succeeding with a project, even though others around me know I can do it. And then, you assign a score. 1, that's not true at all for me. 2, rarely, all the way to 5, very true. So long story short, I pulled 220 women audiologists. And I was 85% of them scored their scores on those like 3 or 4 answers would be consistent with somebody who suffers from imposter phenomenon feelings on a daily basis at a high level. And it just made me go, oh my God. And I sat there, I remember talking about imposter phenomenon in a room full of business owners, audiologists who have their own private practice. And we did that exercise, same sort of results. And somebody asked me, well, what does that mean? I go, you know what it means? It means I'm standing in front of a room full of very smart, intelligent women who think anything but about themselves. And it's just, and again, it can happen. It happens in men too. And I just think it's, life is tough. Life is busy. Life is whatever. And there's just things that we do, whether you're a perfectionist, whether an overachiever, whether, you feel like you have to know everything before you have to make a decision. There's things that I think you sometimes need to take a step back and go, what's my ROI? Is my 80% going to be good enough? Because that's what, sorry to tell you, but that's what I do at Oaktree now. But I think I'm more productive because, instead of going balls to the walls every day on every project, it's like, okay, this is good enough right now. And you know what? My good enough is usually good enough,
good.
But there's other times where you do have to put in 110%, but you're able to do that because you know how to manage the tank. So to speak. So I bet you more people suffer it, experience it more than we think.
Yes, that's definitely one of the takeaways I have from this conversation. All right, so I find this to be a very interesting backdrop to your career. Let's go back in your story a bit, though. We had been talking about your Lybarger speech and the 3 BKs. So number 2 was Bob Keith, who seemed to have a pretty big impact on you as one of your key mentors. So what does Bob Keith mean to you, and what was that part of your career like?
Yeah, so, as the recipient of the Samuel F. Lybarger Award, I said there's like a million dots that had to connect, but there were 3 that were extremely influential in helping me give back to the profession of audiology. So we already heard about Bardika Bamna from Cleveland State. Bob Keith, I don't have the words to, sew together as to what an influencer he was in terms of making me a better audiologist, a better researcher, mainly through his example. He had a tough, Dave, you know me, but man, imagine me younger and more opinionated and louder than I currently am. I was quite the handful. And he was not only, he wore many hats with me. He was a professor, so he was my teacher sometimes. He was at that time I had to get a CFY. I was doing my CFY, my clinical fellowship year, working 20 hours every week to become an audiologist while going to school full time. So he was my CFY supervisor. He was involved with research. We wrote a lot of stuff together. So he was like working as a colleague. I didn't have family in Cincinnati, so there's times he was more of an uncle to me, and he was a mentor. So there's just a lot of different things that he taught me. And the first one I remember from day one when I met him, he's like, well, you're working with me. He goes, so I'm going to tell you, you're going to give back to the profession of audiology in any way that you can without expecting anything in return, because that's what we do. And he set the expectation. He's like, you're going to volunteer for, different organizations, and you're going to do whatever it is that you can do. You're going to become active in your state audiology chapter, and you're going to do research. You're going to do, it just, that was lesson 1. And that was the expectation. He was also instrumental in coordinating the initial meeting with Dr. Peter Frame, who was the director of the AIDS Treatment Center at University of Cincinnati. And that's the whole reason we were able to collaborate and do some pretty phenomenal, interesting research. But working with him really inspired my need to educate and advocate. And again, he's taught me so many lessons. Nothing you'll ever see on a syllabus, nothing you'll gain from a course. He prepared me to be a free thinker, a leader, a researcher, a colleague, an audiologist. And I think if he were not my mentor, I would not have gotten as good of an education, even though I got a great education from the University of Cincinnati.
Well, so when you say, I'm going to give back to the field of audiology, there were probably a lot of instances throughout your career that are representative of that, but there's none more that I can think of than the AAA that never was. I'm probably going to make you cry right now just talking about this.
Oh,
but
such a good program. The best program that never happened, because it was the only program that never happened.
The AAA that never was, the New Orleans 2020 show.
Yeah.
I just remember being at that Eddie show in Kansas City, and that was right around when when the music stopped. And I remember looking at you and being like, you don't think that AAA is going to get canceled, do you? And I think that the thought hadn't really fully occurred to you yet, because you were pretty adamant, like, I don't know.
Well, it wasn't up to me,
Right.
but to me, and I remember because that Eddie conference was right around my birthday. And I was somewhat surprised that the Eddie conference was happening, but then I'm just like, okay, no big deal. I did know that AAA was monitoring it, and it was interesting because Catherine Palmer, who is president-elect, her and I worked a lot throughout the year in preparing the program, along with all the other co-chairs. She called me. She said, hey, I want to talk to you. And I said, okay. And she was so sweet because she said, hey, we have a board meeting and we need to make a decision, but I was just curious to get your thoughts. And I simply told her, I said, well, they had already canceled March Madness. So I was already on a ledge.
Yeah, this is not good.
This is not good. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. But I didn't even have to think. Like, my immediate reaction was, if you have to cancel. It's a pandemic. It's a pandemic. Right. Like, I love audiology, but I'm not willing to get really sick over it, Right. But no, she said, well, thank you for your feedback. And I think she was a little bit surprised because she knew how much time and effort it takes to plan it. But I'm just like, do what you guys need to do. And so when they canceled it, it wasn't surprising. I had to do my little speech. And what was really awesome was the outpour of people just going, I am so sorry. And, it was just really sweet.
Yeah.
But it was such a good program. And I just felt bad for a lot of the first-time presenters. I'm like, man, you're losing this opportunity. And I know that they'll be fine, but it just, it pretty much put things in perspective. And I think what surprised me more, because I'm like, oh, I'm sure, next year Denver will be in person. And that didn't happen, So this was a 2-year thing. Yeah. And it's still ongoing, but I guess we're just better at managing it. But yeah, with the vaccine and all, but yeah.
But did you feel like that was there a little Bob Keith in your head telling you need to step up and be a program chair for AAA? Did that come from that sense of feeling like I need to give back to the profession? Because it's not as if you were getting paid or anything like that.
No.
It was totally a volunteer thing, and you spent a ton of time on that.
Right. And I've always given back to the profession in some way. I used to be when I first came to Missouri, I got on the board. I was, president of the Missouri Academy of Audiology, helped put together the scope meetings. I was on AAA's Government Affairs Committee earlier on. I served on the foundation board. AAA actually approaches individuals, inviting them to be program chair. So when I received the invitation, like when they asked, would you be willing? I think because of Bob Keith and because of what he instilled in me, the answer was, yeah. But I did, your dad was not retired yet. I did have to talk to Bob and Margie, because I told them, I said, this was offered to me. It's going to be a lot of work. I'm going to be using some of Oaktree's time to do this. There's obviously times I'm going to be working in the evenings on this, but I needed their okay too, because, whatever. And they, without hesitation, saying this is a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So that brings us to the third BK.
Yes.
I thought for sure you were going to just say Bob Kemp.
I know.
And so you threw us all for a loop when you said Band of Kemps.
Yes.
But obviously you've been with us here at Oaktree for what is it now, 20 years?
Almost. It'll be 19 years, I believe, in June.
That's so
in
crazy.
January. Yeah.
So I was a young lad when
you were a young lad
when you first started working here. And I guess maybe, we don't need to spend too much time on this, but I just think it's really interesting. First of all, I think that it's important to recognize why you came on board was largely, again, due to your work with infection control. And I know you and Bob wrote infection control in the audiology clinic. So do you want to just start there and talk about how did that come?
So the way that I actually met your dad in person is sort of funny. So when I first came to St. Louis, I was director of audiology at St. Louis University Medical Center. We were having issues with the supplier who was responsible for the audiology supplies. And I remember calling a colleague saying, I'm having issues. I'm like, do you have any suggestions? And I just remember she said, you idiot, Oaktree Products is located in St. Louis. And I was just like, oh my God, I didn't know, I'm like, I didn't know that. So anyway, I sort of met your dad over the phone that way. But when I was assistant professor at Wichita State University, I was coming back from a conference. And I was talking to a colleague saying, Jerry Northern, approached me asking me if I could guest edit a seminars in hearing on HIV/AIDS. And so I was talking to my colleague, and she's like, well, you got everything lined up in your head? I go, yeah. I go, but I got to find this Bob Kemp dude who him and Ross Roser do infection control stuff, and I got to contact him. And all of a sudden, somebody taps me on the shoulder and are you looking for Bob Kemp? I'm like, yeah. He goes, I'm Bob Kemp. And I'm like, no way. And that's how we basically met.
Did he whisper that
in an
to
airport?
you?
I could barely hear him. But I'm like, man, I should have asked I need $1 million. You need $1 million? Here's $1 million. But instead I got Bob Kemp. But no, so that's how we started working together. And then when I became unemployed, I worked for a startup company. Things didn't go well with the product. And, a lot of people got let go. During that time off is when I decided I wanted to write an infection control book. And that's when I reached out to your dad going, hey, would you be interested in co-writing it with me and what have you? So as a result of that, we started talking more about business, and him and your mom, Margie, invited me they wanted to put together a 5-year business plan. They're like, AU, we want you to come in as a consultant to give us a bird's eye view of the industry that's, outside of Oaktree Products. And it was a 3-day meeting. And after that meeting, they actually said, we would like to extend. They didn't see it coming. I didn't see it coming, but we worked so well together that they're like, we'd like to extend a job offer. And I was just like, oh my God. And Bob was like, well, I know you live in Colorado. You probably don't want to. And I said, I actually do. I want to come back to St. Louis. I do, but I want to come back on my own terms. I don't, and it was just perfect. So, yeah.
A million dots had to come together for you to kind of have this career trajectory that you have.
Yeah.
One of those dots, I guess, being when you and I started the blog together.
Remember that? What's a blog?
I was looking through. I went to your blog, and I just started scrolling back to the beginning, and I saw your first post was in 2010, which makes sense.
Gosh.
I would have been
junior
like a sophomore or junior in college.
Yeah.
So I was getting my, marketing degree, and so I was like, I could work in the marketing department at Oaktree.
Yes, you could during the summers.
Which is really funny that we have these departments and stuff when in reality it's just all of us just wearing different hats.
Exactly.
And so I worked closely with you, but that was the first time I ever worked with you. And
yeah.
That was, obviously here we are today doing a very similar thing, just in the 2022 version of it.
Yeah.
Now we're doing a podcast instead of a blog post, but that was so representative of how you and I have always worked together, which is all right, we got to figure this thing out, flying by the seat of our pants. And,
That's right.
And lo and behold, like it turned into this amazing forum for you to share and kind of, I think, be the role that Bob and Margie saw when they wanted to bring you on, which is have always been such a secret weapon for us because you're the liaison to the audiology community. We have an audiologist, and I feel like that's been massively important.
I think also, you know, they brought me in to give objective management, right? Because they wanted to grow the business. But I also feel that our all our principles basically align. So, for example, just because I worked for Oaktree, you know, I remember telling Bob, I go, if I don't think a product's going to work for somebody, I'm not going to sit there. And he's like, oh, no, of course not. And I'm like, okay, I just want to make sure we're clear, you know, because I'm not going to start, you know, whatever. So I think we were all on the same page in terms of different people need different solutions and not everything fits. And if you don't, you know, believe in something, you know, you don't. I mean, when people ask me a recommendation, I just say it. I never sit there and go, oh my God, I need to censor it. I need to make sure it's okay. And that's what it is. We're here to provide busy providers with supplies, options, solutions, to give them the information they need to make the most informed decision. And that's what I love. Yeah. Because, you know, I don't have to, I can just be an audiologist and I can just tell people what I think and what I think, you know, and that was one of my concerns about joining a company.
Right.
Because it's like, oh man, you know, as an audiologist, I was always autonomous. I was always able to go, this is what I'm dispensing. And I don't feel, you know, whatever, but I didn't lose any of that. So it all worked.
It all worked.
Yeah.
So as we kind of wrap up, come to the close, you know, I just think it's so, like, I think the Lybarger is a really good place to kind of conclude it. And I guess, you know, like where things stand with your imposter phenomenon, like, I think that it's really interesting. Like the coolest thing with that whole Lybarger thing was that I didn't realize that whole room of people, you could tell that was a really special room of people. And I remember Michael and I looking at each other, and we were just so in awe and taken aback by the list of nominees, that all the people that nominated you for that award was like, it was like half a page.
So does that mean I'm going to get a big raise next week?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So somebody at work, a colleague at work asked, were you nervous? And I said, no. But let me say this. If this would have happened a year ago in person, I honestly don't think I could have gone on stage. I couldn't, because I probably was not at a place. Well, I probably would have forced myself, but I wouldn't have had fun. I wouldn't have, you know, I would have faked it, and it would have been perfectly fine. But this was something where I was able to go, wow, like I'm very proud and I'm humbled, but wow, you know. And so it was Julie Jakovich who said, were you nervous? I said, no, these were my people, man. I'm like, it was like being in a wedding,
Totally
like at my wedding, people, and just going, oh my God. And it just, I wish more, I wish there was a bigger room. I wish more people could come, simply because I look back at, of all the different honors and awards recipients, it's just an incredible event to go to and just reflect on, you know, the contributions of many different people. And for me to be forever a recipient of the Samuel F. Lybarger Award, which, you know, I'm in the same company of other recipients, Meade Killian and Dr. Singh and David Preeves and Earl Hartford and Elaine Saunders. It's nuts. Yeah. It's crazy.
It is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
But I think it's like it's cool that you're acknowledging that, because I think, again, it's part of this thing of like taking a deep breath and recognizing you've done a lot.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And that
owning your
it.
success.
Owning it.
Well, it's funny because during the group hug, so we have the company has for people who don't know, we don't literally hug ourselves, but we have a company meeting every day, right? Before the phones open, just to say hi and just whatever. And it was funny because I remember somebody asked, wow, like whatever. And they said something like, oh, how was your speech? And I remember I just said, I'm really proud. It was really good.
Yeah.
And I could have never have acknowledged or said that 10 years ago and then 2 years ago. So anyway, yeah, it's nice to be recognized, but for me, it's nice to be able to actually enjoy it.
Yeah, enjoy it. Bask in it.
And bask in the glow.
Awesome. Well, this has been fun. I'm really glad that you finally came on. And
I was so far away down the hall.
So far away. But no, this has been a great first in-person podcast episode. I really do. I think that a lot of people are going to really appreciate this whole topic of imposter phenomenon. And thanks for being so candid about it, because I think that you being willing to be so vulnerable and just transparent about this is probably going to really resonate with some people out there. So I think it's really cool.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Future Ear Radio. For more content like this, just head over to futureear.co, where you can read all the articles that I've been writing these past few years on the worlds of voice technology and hearables and how the two are beginning to intersect. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll chat with you next time.